The United States conducted precision strikes on military targets on Iran's Kharg Island overnight on April 7, 2026, delivering the most strategically significant blow yet in the sustained pressure campaign aimed at forcing Tehran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Kharg Island stands as the undisputed heart of Iran's oil economy. Located in the northern Persian Gulf, this small but critical outpost handles approximately 90% of the country's crude oil exports. Its terminals, storage tanks, and loading piers form the primary gateway through which Iranian oil reaches global markets. Yet in a calculated move, U.S. forces struck more than 50 military positions, command nodes, logistics hubs, and IRGC facilities, while deliberately sparing the island's vital oil export infrastructure. Vice President J.D. Vance publicly emphasized that the operation was not a shift in strategy, but a measured response to Iran's continued resistance on the strait. The strikes sent a clear signal. Washington was prepared to target the regime's military capabilities on its most economically sensitive territory without immediately triggering a full-scale disruption of global energy supplies. Simultaneously, Israeli forces executed a coordinated wave of airstrikes on Iran's rail network. At least 8 to 10 key railway bridges and road sections were hit across central and northern Iran, including locations near Kashan, Qom, Karaj, Tabriz, and other critical junctions. The IDF stated the targets were actively used by the Revolutionary Guard to transport weapons, drones, and military equipment. Bridges and rail lines that once enabled rapid resupply and movement of forces were reduced to craters and twisted metal, severely hampering the IRGC's logistical backbone at a moment when coordination was already under strain. As these military actions unfolded, Iranian officials took an extraordinary symbolic step that revealed the regime's deepening vulnerability. Deputy Minister of Sports and Youth Alireza Rahimi issued a public call for all young people, athletes, artists, students, and professors to form human chains around the country's power plants. State media quickly broadcast footage of civilians gathering at facilities in Tabriz and other locations, linking arms in a dramatic display of national solidarity and a bid to deter potential future strikes on electricity infrastructure. The appeal came amid President Trump's firm 8 p.m. Eastern Time deadline for Iran to fully reopen the Strait of Hormuz or face what he described as devastating consequences, including possible attacks on power plants and additional bridges. This human shield initiative underscored how far the conflict had evolved. For decades, Iranian strategists had invested heavily in underground tunnels, mobile missile systems, hardened bunkers, and dual-use infrastructure to ensure survivability against superior conventional forces. That long-term bet now appeared to be unraveling under relentless multi-domain pressure. The limited but pointed U.S. strikes on Kharg's military sites, combined with Israeli disruption of rail and bridge networks and the explicit threat to power generation, had pushed the regime into a defensive posture once largely reserved for its most sensitive nuclear and missile facilities. The economic consequences rippled outward almost instantly. Iran's continued resistance to fully reopening the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow choke point through which roughly 1/5 of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas normally passes, kept global energy markets on edge. Brent crude prices climbed above the 100 per barrel threshold in intraday trading, while U.S. crude futures also rose as traders priced in the risk of prolonged supply disruptions. Stock markets in Europe and Asia opened with losses as investors weighed the potential for higher energy costs to fuel inflation and slow economic growth. The broader conflict had already driven crude prices up more than 40% since late February. Any further escalation threatened even sharper spikes that could reach consumers at gas pumps and in household energy bills worldwide. Analysts at the Institute for the Study of War and other security think tanks described the day's events as a deliberate escalation within the framework of Operation Epic Fury. U.S. officials framed the Kharg action as a targeted response to Iran's blockade of the strait rather than a pivot toward attacking energy exports. Israel justified its rail and bridge strikes as essential to degrading the IRGC's ability to move weapons that could threaten Israeli population centers or U.S. forces in the region. Both allies stressed that the operations remained focused on military and logistical targets, stopping short, for the moment, of striking civilian energy or power infrastructure. Iran's leadership responded with a blend of public defiance and visible internal strain. State television aired images of the forming human chains, while senior officials denounced the attacks as economic terrorism and vowed retaliation. Yet the regime's capacity to project unified strength was clearly eroding. Missile and drone launches had become sporadic and less coordinated. Supply lines were repeatedly severed. And now the government was calling on ordinary citizens, including youth and public figures, to physically shield power stations, an act that highlighted both a narrative of national resilience and the growing desperation facing Tehran as Trump's deadline loomed. This evolving multi-domain campaign, combining precision airstrikes on military hubs, ground infrastructure disruption, naval posturing in the Gulf, and economic leverage through the Strait, has fundamentally altered the dynamics of the conflict. What began weeks earlier with focused operations against underground missile complexes has broadened into a comprehensive effort to paralyze Iran's ability to sustain its war machine and maintain its economic lifelines. The careful avoidance of direct hits on oil export facilities on Kharg Island demonstrated restraint, but the explicit threats against power plants and additional bridges signaled that such limits could quickly evaporate if the strait remained closed. Global markets continued to react with heightened anxiety. Energy analysts warned that any sustained disruption or closure of the Strait of Hormuz could trigger one of the largest oil supply shocks in modern history. Already, the cumulative effect of the conflict had pushed crude prices significantly higher, with potential downstream impacts on everything from transportation costs to manufacturing and consumer goods. Families far from the battlefield could soon feel the pinch through elevated gasoline prices and broader inflationary pressures. Two broad scenarios now confront decision-makers as the 8 p.m. Eastern Time deadline approaches. In the first, the accumulating military, logistical, and economic pressure compels Iranian leadership to accept a negotiated arrangement that includes reopening the strait and imposing limits on proxy activities, potentially opening a narrow window for de-escalation and indirect talks. In the second, the regime chooses defiance, escalates asymmetric responses through its extensive network of regional militias and proxies, and risks plunging the conflict into a far more destructive phase that could encompass direct strikes on power generation and additional critical infrastructure. What is firmly confirmed from official U.S. and Israeli statements, open-source reporting, and available footage: American forces conducted overnight strikes on military targets on Kharg Island while sparing oil export facilities. Israeli aircraft hit multiple railway bridges and road sections across Iran to disrupt IRGC logistics. Iranian authorities issued a public call for civilians to form human chains around power plants. The Strait of Hormuz remained heavily restricted, contributing directly to rising oil prices and market volatility. What remains uncertain includes whether Iran will comply with the deadline in time, how the regime will manage the domestic human and economic costs of continued confrontation, the precise long-term operational impact of the latest infrastructure damage on IRGC mobility, and whether the current calibrated escalation can still be contained before it spirals into a wider regional or energy crisis with global repercussions. The images emerging from Kharg Island, the damaged railway bridges scattered across Iran, and the human chains of civilians standing guard around power plants together paint a sobering portrait of a conflict that has moved well beyond underground missile bases and secret tunnels. This is now a high-stakes contest for control over the region's energy arteries, its transportation lifelines, and the basic infrastructure that sustains a modern nation under duress. The story unfolding on April 7, 2026, from precision strikes in the Persian Gulf to twisted steel on Iranian rail lines to ordinary citizens linking arms in defense of their power grid, will shape energy security, global financial stability, and the future balance of power in the Middle East for years to come. With President Trump's deadline only hours away, the world holds its breath and watches closely as the next chapter of this rapidly intensifying crisis begins to unfold.